UN, there's a multilateral arms treaty in the works that has the potential to do more harm than good. Joining us now from the Heritage Foundation is Ted Bromond, who has been watching this for us.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me on today. Really appreciate it.
Ted, what's going on with the UN?
Well, the background to this story, Michael, is that on October 31st, 2008, last year, the UN General Assembly voted by an overwhelming majority, 145 to 2, on a resolution proposing the establishment of an arms trade treaty that would establish common international standards for the import, export, and transfer of conventional weapons. One of the nations voting against this resolution was the United States. The other was Zimbabwe. So this resolution looks forward to the creation of a legally binding treaty that would create common international standards for all international transfers of conventional weapons, small arms, revolver bullets, up to battleships, anything in between. This is a very worrying development. Generally speaking, the U.S. has an extremely strong record on controlling international transfers of weapons of all kinds. The U.S. is one of the very few countries that has strong export control legislation on weapons. It's one of the very few countries that routinely prosecutes violators of its own laws. It's one of the very few countries that seriously imposes and passes arms embargoes against countries that oppress their own citizens. What the UN and what the vast majority of the UN's member states are trying to do is to pass a treaty that would hurt the ability of the U.S. to control its own arms sales, that would make it easier for terrorists and dictator states to acquire weapons, that would facilitate states like Iran in restricting the sale of arms to Libya, to Israel, that would create a biased and irresponsible monitoring and enforcement regime around the world, that would restrict the ability of the United States to support genuine armed resistance to dictatorships, and finally, a treaty that would pose a serious danger to the Second Amendment here at home. For all of these reasons, it's vitally important that the U.S. continue to watch this treaty very carefully as it's discussed and negotiated within the UN system, that the U.S. continue, as it's done in the past, to protest strongly against the prospective treaty's bad features, and that it continue to try to bring friendly states to its side to reshape this treaty process and turn it into something that the United States can genuinely support.
Well, how would they enforce this?
Well, this is one of the fundamental problems with almost all international treaties. They're very badly enforced. They tend to be enforced in ways that are prejudiced against the United States, prejudiced against Israel, and prejudiced against a relatively few other number of democracies. The way this would be done probably is that there would be an international monitoring body. It would be for arms trade like the UN Commission on Human Rights, notorious for its bias against Israel and against the United States. Member states would be asked to submit annual reports to the monitoring body, which would then pass resolutions condemning the nations it didn't like and favoring the nations that it did like. This is the kind of body that is almost guaranteed, because of the predominance of dictatorships and non-democratic states in the UN, to be biased against the United States first and foremost, and also biased against Israel. So it's not likely there would be any serious enforcement. In fact, it's likely that the enforcement would be in words only and directed against us, whereas genuine nations like Iran, which really do support terrorists with smuggled weapons, would simply get a pat on the back.
What flaws are inherent in this treaty?
Well, the fundamental flaw inherent in any treaty like this is that the United Nations is very simply a club for states. That's who's in it. Every nation in the world, essentially, is a member of the United Nations. Some nations in the world are good, the United States, so other democracies. Many nations are sort of indifferent, sort of mediocre, and quite a few of them are very bad, dictatorships. Now, the basic problem with any treaty like this is that the treaty that is drawn up is going to reflect the interests of the states that are inside the UN. And a lot of the states inside the UN aren't very good. So the fundamental problem with a treaty like this, just as with human rights treaties, is that the UN does not contain a majority of responsible democracies. Therefore, the treaty will be drawn up in a bad and ineffective way, and the monitoring of the treaty will be done in such a way that is biased against the United States and democracies in general, and in favor of dictatorships and terrorists, because dictatorships, terrorists, and neutralist states form the majority of the members of the United Nations. That's the fundamental problem with treaties like this, be they about arms control or human rights.
Well, what do you think we can do about it, and will this happen?
First of all, we need to bear in mind that we have probably 2 years until the UN concludes its treaty-making process on this subject. So the first thing we need to do is not panic and think it's going to happen tomorrow. We need to keep our eyes very carefully on this to continue to pressure other countries to act in a responsible way, especially democracies who should be on our side on this subject, to continue to speak, as I'm pleased to say we have been speaking, within the treaty-making process against all the negative features of this treaty, and to continue to raise concern inside the UN and outside of it against the negative aspects of this treaty. Now, at the end of the day, if we're unsuccessful in achieving our aims through diplomacy, we're going to be faced with a choice of signing or not signing, ratifying or not ratifying this treaty. In that case, obviously, we must refuse to sign and ratify. And there are many tests that we can use to judge whether the treaty that emerges at the end of the day is one that we can really sign and ratify with good conscience.
In conclusion, what do you think will happen?
I think it's extremely likely that the United Nations will end up drawing up a treaty of some sort. If you take a look at the vote in the UN General Assembly, 145-2, it's obvious that almost the overwhelming majority of states in the world believe this is something that is in their interest to be really in favor of, or at least to pretend to be in favor of. So it's very likely indeed that the UN is going to adopt a treaty. And if they adopt a treaty along the lines the General Assembly has recommended, it will be a bad and irresponsible treaty that the U.S. should continue to oppose. Right now, though, we still have time to stay in the process and to continue to make our point of view as clear as possible, and that's exactly what we should do.
Ted Broman, thanks for being on the Savage Nation.
Thanks, Michael. Real pleasure talking with you about this today, and I hope you'll continue to keep a close eye on this important issue.
I'll be right back. It's the Savage Nation.
Savage.
Hi, we are Armstrong and Getty. We're on every weekday morning from 6 to 10.
He is a national treasure. He is Dr. Savage on Talk 910 KNEW.
You've heard me talk about the release of the Lockerbie bomber and the outrage that's ensuing over the compassionate release. Joining us today is Niall Gardner with his view on Gordon Brown's involvement, even at a distance, in this horrible injustice.
The Prime Minister has finally broken his silence over the shameful return to Libya of the Lockerbie bomber, 5 days after the event. It is too little, too late. Why has it taken British Prime Minister Gordon Brown nearly a week to even express an opinion over the appalling hero's welcome received by al-Megrahi in Tripoli, amid scenes that have sparked outrage and fury in the United States, as well as widespread revulsion at home in Britain? This is not leadership, but moral cowardice on the part of an increasingly spineless Prime Minister who is afraid of offending an odious but oil-rich tyrant with a long history of backing terrorism against Britain and America, as well as brutalizing his own people. Brown declares that he was, quote, angry and repulsed by the abhorrent display put on by the Libyan regime, but clearly not angry enough to condemn the actual release by Scottish authorities of a convicted terrorist found guilty of murdering 270 people, including 52 Britons. His half-hearted comments reflect the ambivalence of the Labour government over terrorism, exemplified by Foreign Secretary David Miliband's recent declaration to BBC Radio 4 that terrorism was justified in certain circumstances. Gordon Brown's pathetic response will do little to soothe the mounting tension between the United States and Great Britain over the Lockerbie issue, or the heartfelt anger of many of the grieving families of the victims of the Lockerbie bombing.
Well, Brown says he wasn't involved, but